Hi there, and welcome to the first OGV Media Group Let's Talk Transition interactive show. I'm Moray Melhuish. I'm the host of the OGV Media Group Let's Talk Transition podcast. I'm also the founder of Annett Consulting. For those of you who don't know the podcast, it's done for the media group. It's done for the OGV Renewables magazine. And I'm sure, like me, you'll have read it cover to cover and you'll have noted all the best bits. So look, from the podcast we've got in this edition, an interview, Hannah Mary Goodlad from Equinor, very interesting. Another great one, Alex Meredith, Project Director from Berwick Bank. Another one, Gabrielle Davis, Global Head of Floating Wind at Ørsted. And yet another one, the Director of Hydrogen Ventures at ERM Dolphin. Hydrogen and floating wind combined. There we go. Now, as well as being featured online, the podcasts can, of course, be found on the website. You can also find them in all the podcasty places you might want to look. So, this today is an interactive show. I'm going to invite my guests on. I've got two great guests for you today. And throughout the guests, throughout the episode, I'd love you to join in the chat, be asking questions, and get involved. On this, we're going to do these every month, and we're going to bring you the latest news and discussions with our partners from the magazine to really bring the magazine and the news from the renewables industry to life. So, as I said, don't be shy, get in touch. So, today I've got with me Anna Musat and Peter Lloyd-Williams. Hi, Anna. Hi, Peter.
Hi, Moray.
Hi, Moray.
Hi, everyone.
So, Anna Musat, you're from Renewable UK. Can you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Renewable UK?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Moray. So Renewable UK is the trade association for renewable energy. We represent all the main renewable technologies, so onshore and offshore wind, green hydrogen, wave and tidal, and solar. And my role is executive director for policy and engagement. Basically, what that means is I look across all the policy landscape to see what is preventing us from achieving the transition to clean energy in a cost-effective way. And on the engagement side, I also think about who do we need to talk to in order to persuade them to make the transition happen. So, sometimes that's the media, sometimes that's politicians and civil servants. So yeah, I'd say overall, really interesting job. And really pleased to be with you today.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Anna. And Peter, tell us about yourself and Westwood Global Energy Group.
Yes, thanks, Moray. My name is Peter Lloyd-Williams, and I'm a senior analyst at Westwood Global Energy Group, which is sort of a research consultancy focused on the energy industry across a number of verticals, obviously including offshore wind, offshore oil and gas, carbon capture, hydrogen, and a few other bits and pieces. And what my role really focuses on is the research side of the offshore wind in particular, quite a few commercial themes. So a lot about leasing rounds, transactions, PPAs, subsidies, that sort of thing is my world.
Brilliant. So, two very interesting, very senior experts, and it'd be great to see your perspective on some of the latest developments. And of course, it's been quite a week in renewables. First of all, we had the announcement of the INTOG offshore wind bids, and then we had publication of the UK government's Green Day or Net Zero energy plan. But of course, was it a boulevard of broken dreams? Will we all be begging to wake me up when September ends? Let's find out. So, let's set the scene then. Back in August 2022, the USA brought into law their Inflation Reduction Act. It was designed to stimulate the green energy industries across the United States, including local manufacturing, the development of low carbon technologies generally. It was about a $400 million package, just shy of $400 million. And then, of course, not wishing to be outdone, the European Union mimicked that with their own Green Deal industrial plan, which was issued in January. Now, yesterday, of course, we had the Green Day announcement, which sees the UK try and stimulate the sector here. Anna, the plans announced are quite wide-ranging. There's a bit of carbon capture, so floating offshore wind, net zero hydrogen fund, the leasing round 5, the formation of Great British Nuclear, improvements to the planning process, and lots more. Um, you know, can you take us through it? What were the highlights for you?
Yeah, sure. I think let me just first take a step back and unpick a little bit what was announced today, because we've seen pages and pages. I doubt anyone's read everything from cover to cover. But basically, what yesterday was about was government giving us a bit of an update on the net zero strategy. You'll remember that a while ago there was a court case against the government on the basis that actually the net zero strategy that they had published previously wasn't really enough to deliver against the carbon budget and put us on track for net zero by 2050. So the announcements yesterday were meant to give us a refresh strategy and basically government saying this is how we're going to get there. We were also due to get a range of other pieces. So, an updated green finance strategy, some stuff around the taxonomy and how we're going to direct investment into green solutions, a refreshed energy security strategy, and as you said yourself, Moray, the UK response to the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, I think there's been a lot of anticipation for that. Everyone was really excited to see what was announced. And I think in the end, we ended up getting part of the announcements that were promised. So, for example, now the UK response to the Inflation Reduction Act has been officially pushed back by the Chancellor. We're likely going to get that in September, so potentially around the autumn statement. But yesterday we did get the net zero strategy refresh. From our perspective, I think a lot of the announcements in there were quite familiar. We've seen some numbers in there which we could easily recognize from previous strategies. So not a huge amount of new money. I guess if you want to be optimistic about it, there have been many changes in government. There have been a lot of changes in the world around us. So it is good to see a recommitment to what the Johnson government basically put forward in terms of the energy strategy. But I think it kind of fell short to the levels of excitement that had been created in the weeks prior. And I think because we've seen a lot of reheated things, and as you said, there's the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, there's the Green Deal Industrial Plan in the EU. I think the sector was really looking forward to something a bit bolder and more ambitious, and something that's really a more joined up plan on how we're going to drive investment over here, not just the piecemeal announcements that we've seen.
Okay.
But there's some good stuff in there as well, which I'm happy to cover in a bit more detail later.
No, that would be great. Yeah. And, Peter, can you take us, we'll go into that a little bit more later, and that'd be fantastic. But Peter, can you tell us what were some of the highlights for you?
So I think in terms of the highlights from the strategy we saw coming out yesterday, for me, particularly from an offshore wind perspective, it would probably be some of the investment in floating port infrastructure, for example, that was promised, and also some of the commitments to speed up and reform some of the planning system. Nothing we haven't seen before, I suppose, in terms of perhaps the content of those two, although the floating ports detail is always good to have. But on the planning side in particular, it's just good to see another commitment to try and speed up the planning situation, particularly for the offshore wind projects, but I suppose across the board in terms of renewable energies and various types of renewable technology. It's all very well and good having the projects, getting them proposed, having the targets, having the supply chain, but then you actually need them to get their final permissions to go out and build. That's a problem that we've seen quite a few projects have had over the last few years running into that hurdle. So it's good to see some recommitment there, but we'll see what actually comes out of it.
Okay. Now, I just want to take a little second, guys. Dan, thank you. I was just about to ask you to post that link for Mimi. So that's Mimi Muswami has asked for us to post a link to the strategy. So Dan's done that. Mimi, tell us a little bit about yourself so that we can get you involved, please. Which business are you from? What's your interest in the energy transition? And hey, George, I see you're joining us too. Hexis Training and the Buyers Stowen Group. Hiya. And Manville, thanks for joining us, Manville. I see you're on an FPSO, so might be interested in some of the hydrogen announcements that we've got coming. So we know that we've had a bit of a mixed picture there from Anna. about how good or otherwise the announcements were, and how new or otherwise the announcements were yesterday. Anna, can you take us through in a little bit of detail? Give us a bit of a flavour for where do you want to start, Anna? Take us through it.
Yeah, so I think obviously the announcements yesterday covered a range of sectors of the economy. So, there were some, again, not super new, but some announcements in relation to how we're going to deploy EVs and how we're going to build charge points. There was some stuff on energy efficiency and how we're going to deploy heat pumps. And actually, there was quite a lot of text in there about the energy sector itself and how we're going to bring all the different technologies in to decarbonize. I think for me, it's really important to think that, the energy sector actually underpins the whole transition, because we need a clean grid in order to decarbonize transport, heating, and all of the other key sectors of the economy. In terms of whether it went far enough, I would say maybe not. I think we still see some very piecemeal interventions. So, Peter's referenced the 160 million for floating offshore wind manufacturing scheme. I think that's a good step forward. We definitely need to invest in ports and manufacturing to be able to deploy floating offshore wind. But actually, analysis from Renewable UK shows that we're going to need up to 4 billion by the end of the decade in order to be able to meet our floating offshore wind ambitions. And that's a really key opportunity to grasp, because many of you will know that fixed bottom offshore wind you can only deploy in shallow waters, so around the coast. It's good for the UK because we've got a lot of those, but actually around the world, most of the waters are quite deep. So deploying floating offshore wind will enable us to capture a bigger market, capture those higher wind speeds that you get further out at sea. And actually about 80% of the world's market for offshore wind is in those deeper waters. So we can create a really important export opportunity for us. So I think, that was a good step, didn't necessarily go far enough. For me, the most exciting things was really seeing those national policy statements for planning coming out yesterday. Again, nothing new. We've been waiting on them for a year, but I think, once you've waited a year, you're really delighted to see them actually come out. And I think some of the details in there are quite promising. One of the things that we've been talking about quite a lot is, as Peter was saying, there's a huge pipeline of projects we really want to deploy quickly and are able to, but sometimes the planning system delays us very significantly. So you can see delays of up to 10 years even when it comes to building the transmission infrastructure for the grid, so that we need, but also connecting the offshore wind infrastructure onshore. So the planning statements basically talk about how some of these critical infrastructure projects will be accelerated to ensure that we can deploy much more quickly. And there's also a consultation on community benefits, which was put out yesterday. The reason why that's important is because with the current planning system, one of the key points of contention is, how do we engage communities? How do we bring them with us? And how do we give them some meaningful benefits for hosting the infrastructure that's important to the whole nation? One of the things we've been talking about for quite a while is that we haven't really got an integrated framework around that. Everyone's approaching it in a slightly different way, and sometimes it can be a bit prescriptive. So it'd be really great to see how that consultation leads to a more integrated framework. I think the planning stuff would be really good. So hopefully that will get us moving.
Great, Anna. It's interesting, actually, that you mention engagement and planning. Of course, it must be very frustrating for the developers, particularly. And I see that Mimi works for Vattenfall. In fact, Mimi, let's just show this on here. Mimi works for Vattenfall, focusing on stakeholder engagement for the offshore operating sites in the UK, Aberdeen, Ormond off Barrow-in-Furness, northwest England, and Ramsgate. So, Mimi, I'm sure you'll have lots of questions for my guests today. And thanks for joining us. Just quickly as well, I'll say, hey, Mark. Mark has joined us from GRS Offshore. Mark, let us know where you are today, as has Sam. Hey, Sam Taylor's from Ocean Infinity. Sam's always traveling, so it'd be good to find out where Sam is joining us from today. And we've got Jalil joining us from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Hey, Jalil, good morning to you. Hope you're having a great day. Now, back to Peter now. Peter, from what Anna just said, there was a lot of positivity there. And I don't want to rain on the parade, but it wasn't all positive, was it? What for you could have been better?
Well, I think if you look at some of these statements and you look at what's been committed, it's not exactly a big bang moment in things of anything particularly changing massively. It's a number of good incremental steps. It's always good to see new policies going forward, and of course having that continued government support. But it's not going to shift the wheel massively in terms of enabling there to be a huge amount of investment offshore, onshore. It's not going to make floating technology suddenly extremely commercially viable. It's not going to make all of the ports suddenly fit for purpose, and it's not suddenly going to make the supply chain able to deliver everything all at once, all locally sourced as we would all like. So obviously good to see partial steps there. But again, as Anna said, nothing particularly revolutionary, nothing that's going to change anything overnight, I would say.
Nothing's going to change anything overnight. Oh well. So tell us too. We've had the news this week isn't just about the Green Day. It's also about INTOG. Anna, can you give us a flavour for what INTOG is about?
Yeah, sure. So we've had the announcement, I think, a couple of weeks ago, slightly losing track because we've had so many announcements. And but I think so. We've had that a couple of weeks ago, which is basically giving leases from the Crown Estate Scotland for developers in Scottish waters, giving them priority to develop projects that broadly fall into two categories. So the in bit of the INTOG is really looking at innovative technologies, not huge scale generation, but innovative technologies that could help with decarbonization. So as part of that, we're seeing some interesting projects coming through that could help with floating offshore wind, could help with growing the supply chain and really showing that proof of concept a lot more. And the TOG part, so that's the targeted oil and gas, which is basically enabling development of renewables in order to decarbonize oil and gas platforms. So, quite an interesting way to see how we can deliver the North Sea transition deal as well and help decarbonize the oil and gas sector, but also supporting the innovation side too. I think we've been really pleased to see some of those projects coming forward, and obviously a lot of the people that have put bids forward are within our membership, and we work with them really closely. I think it's going to be really interesting to see those being developed. One of the concerns that I do have is around how we're going to be able to scale up the supply chain sufficiently in order to deliver those projects and to deliver actually all the projects that we've got in the pipeline around the UK. Because you remember, obviously we are a world leader in offshore wind deployment for now. We haven't been doing as well as we could have done on the supply chain front. So we've been importing quite a lot of things. I think that's really an opportunity for government, and when it thinks about the response to the Inflation Reduction Act, how can we strengthen our supply chains to make the most of these announcements and ensure we can deliver?
Great. And Anna, I'm going to come to Peter in just a second, but Anna, you mentioned there the North Sea transition deal, and I know we've got some international participants today in our show. So can you just remind us, give us a flavor for the transition deal?
Yeah, basically, the transition deal is looking at our oil and gas operations in the North Sea, and part of the deal is about how we're going to help transition that sector to a net zero future. So a lot of it is around how we can decarbonize those oil and gas platforms, power them through renewable energy, how we're going to build carbon capture and storage to offset some of the emissions that are still going to come out of the operations. And essentially also how we're going to bring the people with us. So can we reuse some of the skills? Can we employ people in other sectors and help them transition to renewables or other sectors of the future?
Great. And Peter, tell us a little bit more about the targeting oil and gas part of INTOG. Can you give us an overview of that?
Yes, so the TOG side of INTOG is probably the bit that I was most interested in. I think a lot of people had their eyes on because what an interesting thing it was just in how it was created. So you were essentially had developers putting forward projects to electrify existing oil and gas hubs, which is kind of a niche concept, one that we haven't seen in too many places around the world. And this is really the first time that it was being put at the heart of a leasing process. So really good to be able to see how people were engaging with that. And some of the price metrics that came out in terms of the bids. Some of the complexity is probably worth noting in terms of the TOG side were that developers needed to have two things in place before they could go in with their bids. They needed to essentially have demand from a potential platform or a potential hub saying we need this amount of power, and they needed to be able to supply that power for 5 years. So you essentially, as a developer, were looking around the North Sea, if you were interested in this, going, where can I find somewhere with a platform that has a meaningful amount of power supply that it requires, that's got enough lifetime in it for me to be able to go through the bidding process, go through the consenting, go through the construction, all of that, and then actually plug it in, and then actually provide that power for another 5 years at the very least. And so that was sort of the first hurdle I think a lot of developers had to get into. And as they looked around the North Sea, there weren't that many opportunities that were really jumping out to people. It was quite a challenge to identify places where you could go, particularly when you're looking at, say, some of the technical sides of this. So electrifying fixed platforms is perhaps still a challenge, but I think it's relatively straightforward. Whereas compare electrifying some of the floating infrastructure, which maybe has a little bit of a longer lifespan in certain areas, that would be much more difficult again. So you'd have another set of challenges. You'd first have to find your oil and gas developer, convince them that you were a good business partner, and then convince them that you were the right person to start doing engineering on, say, the turret of their FPSO or something like that. So quite a few interesting challenges for anybody who wanted to get involved in this.
Yeah, so I'm going to come back to you again in a second, Peter. But first of all, I want to just take a look at some of the questions that are coming in. So we've got Cornelius has joined us today. Cornelius is from Derby in England. And he's got an MSc in oil and gas management with Coventry University. And his question is, are there any job opportunities? Now, I'm guessing there will be lots and lots, but right now, probably most in the pre-planning sectors, would you say, Peter?
Yes. So what we tend to find in terms of the job side of things, in terms of the renewables, is that you get a big ramp up when the construction happens because you need all of those people involved, putting the turbines in, those sorts of things. And then you find that the number of people employed on the particular project goes down as you enter the O&M stage. So really what we want to hit in terms of that big job creation is probably a nice wave of projects actually going into the construction side of things on the actual farms themselves. But again, if we want to maximize that opportunity, you really want to look at expanding the amount of the supply chain that you have in country in terms of producing things locally, so to speak. But that obviously poses its own challenge for the industry, because then you're having to look for your procurement based on favoring a particular country, a particular region, rather than going and saying, well, I'll source it from the cheapest person I possibly could find and the one that's absolutely the best for my project economics, which I think is probably what developers and any businessmen would really rather do if they had complete control.
Yeah, absolutely. And Cornelius, thanks for joining us today, and thanks for your question. I'm going to take this opportunity just to put the podcast link up, because, of course, in each episode of the podcast, we talk about how the wind farms are going to be delivered, or the wave project, whichever type of renewables it is, and, of course, what jobs are available and how people get involved. So take a look at the episodes of the podcast, and of course, if you've got any feedback, let us have them. So thank you for that. And who else have we got here? Hey, Søren, thanks for joining us from Copenhagen. Great to have you. It'd be brilliant for you to get some questions through to us, Søren. It'd be great to hear from you. And joining us, Jamie Kirkbride is joining us from Azerbaijan. Hey, Jamie. He says the UK.
I'm here.
Oh, sorry, we've got Siri joining us too. Jamie says the UK is a world leader, but what are governments doing to implement local content initiatives for local businesses and the economy in the UK? 99% of these projects aren't made in country, only installed. Gosh, that's a big deal, isn't it? Anna, can you speak to this one?
Yeah, definitely. I think this was exactly my point earlier. We are a world leader when it comes to how much we've deployed, but not really in terms of the supply chains and how much we produce in the country. So a lot of the components we could manufacture here to a larger extent. We've also got really good strengths in composite materials. We've got an opportunity to innovate when it comes to circular economy, and actually we've got a lot of offshore wind farms blades that are coming at the end of the life. So could we take some of those and repurpose, extract some of those materials, reintegrate them in the production cycle? I think in terms of government initiatives, this is something that Renewable UK is really keen on, and especially as part of the government's response to the Inflation Reduction Act. Because again, if you remember, in the Inflation Reduction Act, you don't just have subsidies and tax breaks for clean energy. You also have some local content requirements. So the gist of the package is really to attract supply chains in the US. For a country like the UK, where the supply chains already aren't incredibly strong, it's a pretty big risk. So I think we need to be much bolder when we think about how we can keep the supply chains here. I mean, one of the options is, of course, to do something similar, offer some tax breaks for supply chains. Of course, we won't be able to compete with quite that level of tax break. But I think it also needs to be socialized in a slightly different way. The US economy is, of course, much larger, much bigger manufacturing base. We can't do it in quite the exact same way in the UK because it will mean higher prices in the short term. But I think what's needed is a genuine industrial strategy for the sector to look at, not just how we're going to hit those targets and deploy more and more across all the different technologies, but how we're going to build the supply chains and how we're going to attract the skills. To Peter's point earlier about, the job requirements and the construction of the project, that's really true. But actually, if we had better supply chains, I think we could offer employment in across the sector in much larger numbers because we could keep those people employed throughout. So I think the development of the supply chains is really critical, and I hope that that's what we're going to see in the government response to the Inflation Reduction Act that's now coming in the autumn.
Great. And Peter, in terms of the challenges for INTOG and TOG particularly, how do you see this stacking up?
Well, I think delivering TOG in particular is going to be quite a challenge for the industry. I mean, nobody's done this anywhere in terms of hooking up electrification to oil and gas platforms. It's something that a couple of people have in terms of it's their leading concept, but again, it's going to be difficult for developers to actually come out and do this. I mean, it's not something the supply chain really has any experience with, so you can't just port it over from elsewhere. You've got to be the first person going in. Thinking a little bit more generally in terms of what maybe policy levers we can see to try and pull and to try and ensure sort of maximum amount of local employment. We've been seeing various bits and pieces be incorporated, particularly into the various leasing rounds that we've seen through, say, also the allocations of the contracts for difference, which is essentially the subsidy/support scheme for renewable energy, where the government's been moving to a position of saying, in order to participate in this, you must produce a plan that says, how are you going to try and integrate the local supply chain? And there are obviously questions about how effective that is. And I think something we've generally seen is a trend towards these criteria being made a little bit more stringent. But then that's also something you're seeing happening in multiple countries around the world. So it's happening in Germany, it's happening in France, it's happening in Holland, it's happening in the US. As everybody says, how can we all build it all locally? You then start to get the question of how can we continue to deliver it at the same low cost. That is why everybody likes it and why everybody is so enthusiastic in the first place. So there's definitely a challenge and a balance for the industry between integrating the local supply chain and making sure that those opportunities are available, while also continuing to deliver the most cost-efficient form of power that you can. Because if you start to lose the latter, then the incentive for delivering the former becomes a little bit more weaker.
Yeah, absolutely. Isn't that just the case? Now, Peter, I just want to go back quickly to some of the questions here. So, who have we got? Yes. So we had. Who have we had? Give me 2 seconds. There we go. Catch
Sorry,
up.
while you're looking for the questions, can I just add a quick point to because Peter mentioned the contracts for difference scheme, and I think something that's really interesting to look at in recent years is obviously through the contracts for difference scheme, we've had prices for generation dropping down quite significantly. So I think in the previous allocation round, we've had contracts signed with a price of around £37 per megawatt hour. So quite low prices. I think in terms of supply chain development, something that we'd really like government to look at is how they can encourage through the bidding process much more sustainable prices, because actually in the current context it just costs more to build, and we've got inflation and we've got the rising cost of labor. So it would be really interesting to see how can we keep this competitive process, keep the downward trends on pricing, but actually ensure that we have more sustainable margins, because that's also going to incentivize the investment in the supply chain that we need.
It seems like that's right. It seems like quite a balancing act, though, doesn't it? Because we're bringing down the levelized cost of energy, which is fantastic. We're making energy cheaper for the United Kingdom, and actually we're exporting it too, or we're going to export it. And at the same time, all the costs are rising. And on top of that, as we had, as Jamie mentioned, we want more local content too. We want more local jobs. How do we balance out these competing requirements? What's the answer? Peter, have you got any ideas around that?
I wish I did. There are quite a few paradoxes going on there. If you think we've got all of these developers who want to get interested in the sector, but at the same time, they're also talking about how returns aren't great. And we've got governments talking about how they're pushing up targets. Everybody wants to build out more, but at the same time, the supply chain is saying they don't have enough capacity to build everything. And at the same time as the supply chain is saying we don't have the capacity to build anything, that they're also saying that they're not making any money. So there's a range of contradictions within the industry that people really have to address, and I think as a market they'll have to work through, probably in terms of establishing a durable local component. I think probably part of that comes from being able to build up your industry, and then you can start to localize some of it. If you start to localize in the first instance and then you try and build up, you have the little bit more of the challenge of trying to go from zero to something rather than going from something to something more. So the UK, I think, is in a perhaps a reasonably decent position in terms of having some of that infrastructure already in place. But again, a lot of contradictions to be dealt with, and a lot of longer term macro questions for the industry.
Great. And remember, guys, keep your questions coming, and let us know which company you're from, and of course where you live as well. That's always fun and interesting. So far, we've had some brilliant questions. And here's another one from Mark O'Callaghan from GRS, the shipbrokers. So Mark says, as well as the supply chain, in fact, why don't I put this on screen for you? There we go. As well as the supply chain, are there initiatives to make sure that the personnel skills are developed so that there are enough skilled workers for every stage of the project lifecycle? Gosh, that's a big question, isn't it? And actually, it's right on the button, because it's not all about steel. It's not all about cables. There's a lot of different skills required to deliver these renewable energy projects and the energy transition. So, Peter, any thoughts and advice on this?
I'm not sure I've got anything specifically to say in terms of initiatives to make sure that there are the skills, but I think there's definitely been a question of the amount of people who want to be involved in this space is going up. At the same time, the number of people who have the skills to deliver it is still somewhat fairly static. So the draw on the number of people is probably going up, and that's probably a decent thing overall for the creation of decent value jobs. But again, at the same time, it's a challenging question of trying to identify what do you put in place first. Do you have the industry, which will draw in the people, or do you have the people which can then benefit and be a base for the industry to come out of? So again, one of those really tough questions that involves the intersection of the market and various other bits and pieces.
That's right. And I don't know about you, but I always think one of the challenges for the energy transition is that young people, and this is a generalization, of course, but young people don't generally want to work in oil and gas. They want to work in offshore wind, but some sectors, like the subsea sector, which of course I'm very familiar with, works across both entirely fluidly. But yeah, of course, we need a managed energy transition. We can't just jump immediately from one to the other, and that means we need to keep employment going in both industries while we ramp up the renewables. Anna, would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And, I love that question, because I think skills is one of the aspects of the transition that we don't really talk enough about. I think there are some brilliant initiatives from developers, and a lot of our members actually have initiatives to, go into schools and talk to people about the opportunities in the clean energy sector, get them interested, maybe partner with universities to give people a bit of a flavor as to what it actually means to work in this sector, what kind of skills are needed. But I think the problem that we have is that all of those rely on individual initiatives of different companies, and ultimately that just gives you a bit of a patchy picture. There is some analysis that says, in order to meet our targets to decarbonize the energy sector by 2050, so to become net zero, we will need to recruit about 400,000 people in the UK. And obviously, we've got changes to our immigration system. It's a pretty constrained pipeline as well. We've got issues with diversity anyway, and that's not just the energy sector. That's pretty much across the economy. So, from my perspective, what we need is a really a government effort to ensure that we are looking at the skills that we're teaching young people in schools. Are they relevant to the jobs that they're going to be doing in the future? Do we need to update the curricula? Probably. And is there a good link between what we're teaching in schools and then what employers need? Because some people want to go directly into employment. They don't want to go through loads and loads of further education. So ensuring that we teach people the skills that they're going to be able to use immediately is going to be really important. Then also, let's make sure that we get apprentices right, because we have apprenticeships. They're not really working that well for employers and not providing the skills that they need. And then, of course, there's the point that you mentioned earlier about the just transition angle, and how do we get people with the transferable skills to come into the sector and work here? And are there any other initiatives that we could support? So at Renewable UK, we work with Mission Renewable, which looks at bringing Army veterans into the renewable sector, providing them the support for upskilling, which I think is a really interesting initiative. So, it would be great to see something like that at bigger scale and really coordinated and driven forward by government, but of course with support from the private sector, because everyone's really keen on this and they need the skills quite urgently.
Excellent, good stuff. Brilliant, Mark. Do you agree with what we've been said, and is enough being done in your sector of the energy transition to encourage skilled workers for the next generation? Be good to know. And we've got John Bloomfield with us today. Hi, John. John actually likes the doors behind me. My wife will be delighted. Thank you very much, John. And Arif, hi. Thanks for joining us. Arif, let us know where you're from. Jamie Kirkbride was responding earlier on. I appreciate the response, Anna Musa. Thank you. That's to John's earlier question. Government tax reliefs would help 100%. Well, wouldn't they just? Wasn't it a bit of a surprise that Green Day didn't do anything about windfall taxes? Anna?
I mean, to be honest, I wasn't really keeping my hopes up for any sort of fiscal measures as part of Green Day, because let's remember we had the budget very shortly before. And I think, yes, it would have been great to have something about windfall taxes. They are generally destabilizing the investment environment quite a lot. And we have a few other potential changes afoot in the energy sector, because, yes, we've had an energy crisis, and there's been a bit of a political pressure to respond to that in ways that maybe sometimes aren't great for the longer term. So yes, it would have been great to see something on the windfall taxes. It would have been great to see something on tax breaks. And actually, something that I was really keen to see in the budget itself was this point around capital allowances and offering enhanced capital allowances for companies to be able to offset some of the tax they pay for investment in infrastructure and equipment. Those are great, what we got, but they're only in place for 3 years. So that's really not enough. And if you think about who's developing these big energy infrastructure projects, they're not going to be able to construct all of that in 3 years. So it's quite likely that a lot of the expenditure will fall outside of that time. Again, if we go back to the US, the tax breaks that they offer, the subsidies, they're in place for 10 years. I think we need to do something a bit closer to that to provide that longer term certainty to investors. So, 3 years, yes, good start, but ideally we'd have something on a bit more of a permanent basis.
Great. And, just thinking about taxes, of course, only in a Scottish context, but we've actually been invited to meet and record a podcast with the Scottish Energy Minister at Holyrood in Edinburgh, and that'll be taking place in the next few weeks. So if any of you, Peter, Anna, any of our guests have got questions you would like asked of the Scottish Energy Minister, then do let us know, and we look forward to asking those. So great. So that was another great question, Jamie. Thank you. Who else would we like to say hi to? Hey, Dennis Kelly. Hey, Dennis, let us know who you're with and where you're from. Dennis wanted to add to Mark's point there around encouraging people in the sector and the next generation of people, which was I tell you what, I'll put it on. How about that? Vessels to construct and transport hydrogen will be big constraints. Actually, it's more than just, vessels to construct. That's a big deal, isn't it? Because we've got INTOG and Scotland coming at the same time as other developments elsewhere in the UK and the rest of Europe as well. And we've already got a shortage of vessels in the offshore construction industry, offshore survey industry, geotechnical industry. There's a shortage of all of these things. There's a shortage of people. How do we deliver it all? Peter, any thoughts? Is it doable?
It's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think if the market is there, it's going to be doable. But if the market isn't there, then it's not going to be doable, which is always a bit of a trite answer. But I think what it comes down to in the end, on the H2 transport side in particular, I think that's an interesting one in terms of identifying potential export opportunities. I think someone once talked about the UK as potentially being the Saudi Arabia of wind. And really what's that about? It's about being able to generate energy relatively cheaply or extract it and then being able to export it. Because it's once you start to get into the export market that you really start to be able to deliver some of those great economic returns. So it'll be really interesting to see how the hydrogen, the e-fuels, and the power to X arrangement of the market goes forward. I think if that's something that can be cracked, if we can create a system there where we're able to, as an industry in general, be able to put power into the grid where it's viable, then create e-fuels that then able to go off, be shipped, arbitrage like a regular commodity, we can start to become an industry that's particularly self-sustainable. So another big challenge there, particularly interesting on the H2 side, in terms of the limitations on the construction vessels. If you go and speak to your friendly neighborhood shipbroker, they'll always tell you that you should have ordered a vessel 3 years ago and the best time to do it is now. So I think that's one where the market has a tendency to correct in time. And it's perhaps a bit of an onus on developers to make sure that you book your projects out in advance, make sure that we've got that visibility of the supply chain. It'll probably correct itself in time, but as an individual client, there is the opportunity, or there is the chance that you can get burned and there aren't the vessels that you need at the time you need them and you end up paying the absolute premium.
Yeah, it's a worry, isn't it? Because it takes a good number of years to build these vessels. And wow. Anna, any more thoughts on any of the constraints and concerns around this?
I think I agree with what's been said already. I think one of the challenges that we have, again, going back to the contracts for difference mechanism, one of the problems that we have in terms of growing the market and growing the supply chain itself is that, as a developer, you get certainty that you're going to have fixed revenue from your project through these contracts for difference. But actually, by the time you get your contract awarded, it's almost too late already to invest in the supply chain. So something that we're considering at Renewable UK and others in the industry are also really interested in that is how can we achieve that? How can we achieve that de-risking that happens a bit further ahead? Because for example, if you think about ports and ships and everything else that you need to construct, and even the grid, we haven't talked about grid. That's a huge issue. All of that needs to be constructed ahead of time. And all of that requires money from developers, but they are quite unlikely to give it to you unless they know for sure they've got a contract. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. And I think we need to explore a bit more how can we evolve the contracts for difference mechanism? How can we create those funding pots to enable that investment in infrastructure ahead of time? We're already seeing really big waiting lists for delivery of different supply chain elements. So we definitely don't want to make that worse with targets going up across the board. And you've mentioned the European context as well. We're probably relying on the same supply chains, realistically speaking, and a lot of companies are pan-European. So I think it's something that we need to tackle quite urgently.
Great. So Dennis tells us he's an energy capabilities researcher in TU Dublin. Great, Dennis. Brilliant question. Thanks for that. That was really good. And here we go. Another one from Dennis, actually. Dennis, you're on fire today. On the grid side, you're limited in quantity of renewables, which will far outstrip demand. So energy conversion to hydrogen off grid is almost as certain. What do you think, guys? Anna?
Yeah, so I think we also represent green hydrogen developers, and we think it's a really good way to develop the energy storage. Of course, we have a lot of days when we have really high wind speeds, we have a lot of sun, so virtually we're just wasting renewable energy because we've got an inadequate grid and we don't have the storage that we need. There's different storage technologies out there, like batteries are evolving in capability and coming down in cost. But hydrogen actually offers the opportunity to scale that up much faster. So I think it's really important that we invest in that and we use it as a way to integrate renewables. But yes, at the same time, I think we need to definitely accelerate the rate of grid development and ensure we've got the right transmission infrastructure, because it's ridiculous that we're wasting cheap power when we could actually be either storing it or exporting it to someone else.
Great. And Peter, Anna mentioned before, the grid connection and the infrastructure that's required. But of course, where do we actually build it? And, thinking about the TOG in particular and the successful projects, is there a pattern there? Was there anything of interest to the locations? Tell us about that.
Well, in terms of the TOG locations, most of the sites that were popular with bidders were essentially just in the proximity of platforms that had a relatively long lifespan that's still expected. So Buzzard in particular is a platform that's expected to keep producing out until the 2040s, most likely, and we saw a couple of bids in that region. Feeding that back into the grid, the mainland grid, is another challenge which was essentially presented to everybody on the TOG side of things. So you could just say either supply it to your oil and gas platform and no one else, and you risk not having enough demand, or you try and link it into the grid and into the oil and gas platform, in which case you're doing something which is innovative, perhaps in two ways. So grid is, I think, an important one, one that perhaps is sometimes not getting as much attention because it sort of falls behind the big interesting thing, which is the turbine or the factory or whatever. But yeah, if you look at the grid connections for some of the ScotWind projects, for example, they've got them in place, but they're not until the 2030s. So getting that, not only getting the grid to shore, but then also getting the onshore grid to where it needs to be is also an important thing. So it's one thing if we can get the power from offshore to onshore, we can get it through permitting and people will let us build there, and then getting it from onshore to where it needs to be elsewhere onshore, because we have limits with the amount of capacity that can go on the grid itself. So that's definitely one that we're facing both here in the UK and everywhere else, in terms of how do we essentially get a system that can deal with more power, get it to different places, and deal with things like storage, hydrogen, batteries.
Absolutely. Now, we're running a little bit short of time, but I'm keen to get through as many questions as possible, guys. So Nabil says hi. Hi, Nabil. Tell us where you are, which company you're from. Thanks for joining us. John Bloomfield. Hey, John again. John's got a question or a point. There are many personnel shortages within the industry, and it is good to see that operators are investing in STEM education and providing awareness and encouragement into the sector. I do worry there's potentially a decade gap while the new, oh gosh, I can't see the rest of your question, while the new people come through. Yes, I think that is a bit of a worry, isn't it, John? And not just in this sector either, but across the whole piece. What else have we got? Cornelius, currently job hunting. Good luck, Cornelius. Wish you all the very best with that. Nabil, thanks, Nabil. Here we go. Nabil, the biggest issue is aging workforce means there are skill shortages across all engineering sectors. That's right. That agrees with John's point, doesn't it? Therefore, it becomes really difficult to attract people from other sectors. The long-term solution is attracting the next generation in schools or hiring overseas talent. That's right. We need to take on an example from the Middle East. Well, isn't that right? And the problem is, of course, we can't just go plundering everywhere for people. We can, but we've also got to do our own bit, don't we? We need to generate people. And Nabil tells us he's in Manchester working for Morrison with 2 decades of Recruiting and infrastructure projects. There we go. Excellent, Nabil. Thank you. And look, I think this will be our last question. We might just manage one more today. So we've got Jamie Kirkbride coming back in. Here we go, Jamie. You want to say, you mentioned that profitability on these projects are low, and those hit most are the guys at the bottom of the supply chain. How can this be avoided? Regarding vessels, I heard that the rates are too high for the renewable operators. And sorry, the technology is not quite working here, guys. I heard that the rates are too high for renewable operators, and I've even heard cases that the same vessel can earn 10 times more for a project in the oil and gas industry. Well, Jamie, that's a good point. Guys, are we doing enough to protect the people at the bottom of the supply chain? Anna?
Well, I think because we're seeing this race to the bottom in terms of prices, which, I understand we need to prove that this technology is continually innovating and going down in cost. I think we've actually entered the land of unsustainable prices. And as Jamie says, that's really hurting the supply chain as well. There are some potential solutions around that. And I think, we just need to start trying some of them. We don't know which one's going to work perfectly, but, we can start exploring, as I said, tax breaks for supply chain. We can look at local content provisions, and we can look at some PPAs and all these different options, which I think will, again, guarantee that pipeline of demand for the supply chain, which is really what they need in terms of scaling up their capacity to deliver, and also the ability to access some of those tax breaks, enhanced capital allowances. But I think, we just need to start trying something, because we haven't really tried a huge amount to date, and we need to protect the supply chain.
Great. So, it's been a really interesting conversation, hasn't it? So Green Day seems to be a little bit of a damp squib. Lots of recycled announcements all packaged together. But I guess we'll just hope for the government to do better in future. INTOG, of course, really interesting as well. Lots of major projects involved there. But how easy is it going to be to deliver, along with ScotWind and all of the other renewable industry requirements, all those demands on the vessels and the people, and there's a shortage of people, expensive steel, increasing interest rates. It'll be fascinating to see how we navigate everything, won't it? Now, if any of you out there are interested in finding out more about some of the INTOG projects, if you look online at the podcast, you'll find on their podcasts from Dan Jackson, the co-founder of Cerulean Winds, of course, major INTOG bidder with 3 sites. In the magazine, you'll find in the latest magazine, you'll find the interview with Alan McCaskill, the co-founder of Flotation Energy, another INTOG winner. And you might be interested too in the ARM Dolphin project, the floating offshore wind to hydrogen project, which is also featured on the podcast. So, of course, you'll find all of those online, ogv.energy/news/podcasts. So that's it, guys. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you especially to Anna and Peter for joining us. If you're interested in finding out more about the magazine, finding out more about the podcast, maybe even taking part, get in touch. My email address is there. It's murray@anetconsulting.com. And I'd love some feedback. I'd love suggested questions. Keep those questions coming, especially for the Energy Minister. And thank you all, everybody. And I hope to have you back on the Let's Talk Transition live show again soon. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. Thank you.